18 years ago, 55-year-old Donna Fitzgerald was a veteran corrections officer with the Florida Department of Corrections, having served for 13 years. On June 25, 2008, a Wednesday, Donna, being the kind-hearted person she was, volunteered to cover a colleague's shift when he had an emergency at home. As a single mother who has raised her children alone for many years, she knows the importance of family only too well. So when her colleague had a family emergency, she'd take over for him. Around 7:30 p.m. that evening, she was standing in the prison workshop as usual, overseeing 13 male inmates, including rapists and violent repeat offenders, who were working there. According to the rules, at least 2 officers should be present when the inmates are working. However, as there hadn't been any riots or accidents involving inmates for a long time, supervision had become lax, and Donna was the only corrections officer present. So, when Hall, an inmate who was hiding in the welding shed next to the workshop because he had illegal drugs on him, was discovered, she had to go there alone. After entering the welding shed, Hall attacked quickly and viciously. The autopsy report showed that Donna had about 22 to 25 stab wounds all over her body, some of which pierced through her lungs and heart. In reality, Donna's death is not an isolated case. Examining the criminal history of the United States as a whole, while it is rare for female prison officers to be killed by inmates, most of these cases reveal systemic risks within the prison system. The earliest and most suspicious case happened at Greenhaven Correctional Facility in 1981. The victim was female corrections officer Donna Payant, and the convicted inmate was Lemuel Warren Smith, a notorious serial killer. Considered one of the most dangerous prisoners in the New York prison system, he was kept in isolation for 23 hours a day with no human contact. Smith confessed to 5 murders for which he could have been sentenced to death, yet he still maintains to this day that he was framed for Payant's murder. Surprisingly, even Payant's son said, "I know he's a bad guy, but I don't think Smith did it." So here's a strange question. Why would a serial killer who has killed at least 5 people insist on denying this one particular charge? Is he lying, or is there some hidden truth to his claims? But to find the answer, we first need to understand his story, personality, and character. Smith was born on July 23, 1941, in Amsterdam, New York. He was born into a family with strong religious beliefs and was their 4th child. Back then, many black families were experiencing breakdowns and hardships, such as having a father in prison or one who had abandoned his family. Fortunately, Smith had a complete family. His father worked the night shift as a laborer at a General Electric plant. He didn't go to prison or divorce his wife, nor did he shirk his responsibilities. His mother was a full-time homemaker. She was deeply religious and strictly followed religious customs, regularly taking the family to church. On the surface, it seemed like a stable family. Dad worked outside the home while Mom took care of the house. But that wasn't the reality. It was actually his parents who left indelible scars on his childhood. For instance, from the time he was born until he was 12, Smith always slept with his mother. Her reasoning was that his dad worked the night shift. If he did not comply with her demands, she would threaten him, saying things like, "The Indians will take you away." Some social workers also accused his parents of physically punishing him. Although there is no solid evidence to support this claim, it raises questions about what was really going on inside that family. The boy's mental state gradually started to deteriorate as he grew up in that kind of environment. And besides the mental trauma, he also had frequent head injuries during his childhood. The first was when he was 6. The second time was when he was 10. He fell out of a tree while playing and hurt his head. All these experiences, involving both physical pain and mental trauma, shaped Smith's personality without his realizing it. Between 1951 and 1958, he repeatedly sexually harassed girls, stalking them, forcing kisses on them, and touching them inappropriately. In December 1957, age 16, he was indicted for burglarizing 2 stores in Amsterdam. Just a month later, on January 21st, Smith robbed and beat to death a 46-year-old woman named Dorothy Waterstreet. Although Dorothy's neighbors provided key evidence pointing to Smith, the district attorney was too eager and used illegal coercion, causing the evidence to fall apart. In the end, he got away without being imprisoned. That same summer, he went to Maryland and he didn't hold back at all. He kidnapped a 25-year-old woman named Edna and nearly beat her to death. Fortunately, a witness interrupted the attack, frightening him away and saving Edna. Following a year of investigation and appeals, because of how serious the assault was, Smith was tried as an adult. On April 12, 1959, he was charged with attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. In May 1968, nearly 10 years later, Smith was granted parole and returned to the New York Capital Region. However, prison had not changed him for the better. On May 20, 1969, he kidnapped and raped a woman for the first time. Luckily, the woman managed to escape with the help of a nearby couple. Later that same day, he kidnapped and raped a 46-year-old woman who was a friend of his mother's. Initially, Smith had planned to kill her, but since she was a friend of his mother's, she told him that if he let her go, she wouldn't tell anyone about it, especially not his mother. Hearing this, Smith agreed to her request. However, as soon as she got home, she reported it to the police. Then the police arrested Smith immediately, charging him with robbery, kidnapping, and possession of a dangerous weapon. Several months later, on November 11th, the judge found him guilty of attempted rape, assault, and unlawful imprisonment, sentencing him to an additional 4 to 15 years indeterminate imprisonment. On the eve of Thanksgiving in 1976, Robert, who was 48 years old, and Margaret, who was 59, were killed in the Hederman's religious store in downtown Albany. The store, which mainly sold religious items, was scheduled to open that day, but this never happened. When their bodies were found, the post-mortem examination revealed that Robert and Margaret had both suffered severe blunt force trauma, strangulation, and slash wounds to the throat, indicating a violent attack. A piece of clothing covered in feces was also found at the scene. The next day, investigators questioned Smith, who was 35 years old and already out on parole at the time. Given his history of burglary, robbery, and violent crimes, and the fact that he worked near the Hederman store, he was considered one of the prime suspects. However, due to the limited physical evidence and the series of unsolved violent crimes that were happening around that time, investigators initially treated it as just a robbery and did not take it seriously. A month later, 24-year-old Joan was kidnapped in the parking lot of the Colony Center Mall in Albany County. She was raped, stabbed, and dismembered. By that time, in the Hederman murder case, investigators had already gathered more evidence linking Smith to the crime. There was a witness identified Smith from a photo as the suspicious person who had been seen at the crime scene, and gray hair matching Margaret's was found in his work locker. However, despite the growing body of evidence, Smith still wasn't arrested. So, a new tragedy was born. In July 1977, 30-year-old Marilee was kidnapped in downtown Schenectady. Her murder was almost identical to Joan's. She was raped, stabbed multiple times, and the killer even left bite marks on her nose. In August, Smith was arrested for kidnapping and raping an 18-year-old girl named Mary Ann. The following month, while examining photos of Marilee, a New York State police lieutenant noticed the bite marks on her nose. Further investigation and forensic analysis confirmed that these bite marks perfectly matched Smith's dental impressions, providing solid physical evidence that he had killed her. Then, at the end of October, investigators conducted a police dog identification experiment. Smith was escorted to Bleecker Stadium in Albany by the police, where he and 4 other men were randomly positioned behind 5 screens at one end of the stadium. Meanwhile, at the other end of the stadium, a police dog was led to sniff the piece of clothing that had been found in the Hederman store. Shockingly, the dog went straight across the stadium to Smith. In order to ensure the experiment was accurate and the dog was unable to see, the 5 men were rearranged at random and the experiment was repeated twice. But each time, the dog all went straight to Smith. Faced with the growing evidence, including the matching bite marks and the results of the police dog tracking, on March 5, 1978, Smith confessed to 5 murders at the New York State Police Academy: Robert, Margaret, Marilee, Joan, and the murder of Dorothy from 20 years ago. In these crimes, Smith's method of operation showed a clear pattern. He would typically stalk potential victims and use knives he brought to the scene to control and attack them. After sexually assaulting them, he would kill them by stabbing or strangulation. He would also tie them up with their own clothing or other available materials and mutilate their bodies after they were dead, such as biting, cutting them. During the trial, he tried to defend himself by claiming insanity. He revealed his own psychological issues, including having multiple personality disorder. He insisted that he was controlled by the spirit of his deceased brother, who had actually died before he was even born. In 1979, the Albany County jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life for each count, with a stipulation that he would not be eligible for parole until at least 50 years had passed. Since he had no chance of getting out of prison, the charges related to Marilee and Joan were eventually dismissed. Donna Payant was a 31-year-old mother of 3 kids. She started working as a corrections officer at Greenhaven Correctional Facility in April 1981. At that time, Smith, due to a staff shortage, he was assigned maintenance work in the chaplain's office, which allowed him to enter the office without supervision. On May 15, 1981, during her afternoon shift, Payant received a phone call. She then handed her keys and radio to a colleague saying, "Hey, I gotta go. There's a problem with my shift and assignment." After that, she walked down the prison corridor toward the chaplain's office. 5 hours later, Payant's colleagues noticed that she hadn't left the prison and had disappeared without trace. Hundreds of prison officers searched the entire prison. It wasn't until the following morning that 2 officers escorting a refuse truck to empty the bins discovered Payant's dismembered body. The autopsy revealed that she had suffered a severe beating and strangulation. However, as the landfill machinery had crushed her body, the medical examiner was unable to determine whether she had been sexually assaulted. This was the first time that a female corrections officer had been murdered inside a prison. Over 5,000 officers attended her funeral, and the investigation led by New York State Sheriff Francis quickly got underway. Given that Payant's last known location was the chaplain's office and Smith was the only inmate who had access to it without supervision, and the investigator who found bite marks on Marilee's body noticed that those on Payant's were almost identical, and subsequent dental comparisons confirmed that they were caused by Smith. This forensic evidence conclusively identified Smith as the murderer. As media attention grew, despite the complexity and controversy surrounding the case, the murder trial was set to begin on January 20th, 1983. During the trial, the defense questioned the testimonies of the inmates and other prison officers, even putting forward conspiracy theories in an attempt to prove that Smith had been framed. However, they could not provide a reasonable explanation for the bite mark evidence. On April 21st, the jury found Smith guilty. According to New York law at the time, Smith was automatically sentenced to death, as this was considered the only effective deterrent for inmates who were already serving life sentences. On June 10th, he was formally sentenced to death. However, on July 2nd, 1984, his appeal was successful and his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. But, as punishment for Payant's murder, and considering that Smith still posed a threat inside the prison, he spent almost the next few decades in solitary confinement, which was the longest period of isolation in the entire United States at that time. As time went by, Payant's murder case had been closed. But in 2025, Payant's son, Chris, brought up the murder again. Chris was also a corrections officer. He carried on Mom's legacy, becoming a corrections officer and working for 28 years. In an interview, he said that he wanted to reopen the investigation into his mother's murder. He and most of his family members believe that the core reason for her death was the active drug trade inside the prison, and she was either forced or asked to become a drug dealer or middleman. Greenhaven Correctional Facility, the maximum security prison located in Stormville, New York. It was in serious operational disarray in the early 1980s. The prison had lax discipline, with inmates being able to move freely in certain areas, and institutionalized corruption gradually took root, with staff maintaining a facade of order through exchanges of cash, gifts, and favors. During the 1983 trial, Smith claimed that he was framed by other corrections officers. He said that these officers had blackmailed Payant with compromising photos, forcing her to participate in the prison's drug gang. He told that she was going to reveal corruption in the corrections department and she was killed to keep her mouth shut. Payant couldn't take anymore. That signed her death warrant. When Chris was asked about a key question, which was also the most important piece of evidence that led to Smith's arrest, the bite marks he allegedly left on Payant's body, Chris believed that those corrections officers should have known about his criminal record and his penchant for leaving bite marks on his victims, so they could have made a mold in advance. When it came time to kill his mother, they could use that mold to frame Smith, because he was the only one who could access the chaplain's office unsupervised. He was the perfect scapegoat. Nobody knows the truth of the case for sure, but from Smith's story, it's clear that he's not a kind criminal. He only confessed to the 5 murders because investigators had enough evidence to charge him. Without solid proof, he wouldn't have admitted anything.